Marvel gave one of the youngest artists of all time $3 million to help save some of their failing comic book titles. Because just a few years prior, he actually had the #1 selling comic book of all time with X-Force #1, and that of course is Rob Liefeld. Rob Liefeld broke into the comic scene very young, so young that actually one of his first comics that he ever worked on, he didn't even have his driver's license yet. From an early age, he always wanted to be a comic book artist, and he got in at just the right time when comics were at an all-time high, selling millions of copies. He ended up branching out at an early age of 25, making his own comic book publishing and joining Image Comics. At such a young age, breaking into the comic scene, he later became the #1 selling comic book artist of all time. But he is also notorious for being one of the worst artists of all time. Can't draw feet, just can't draw the human form in a realistic manner whatsoever. So let's take a look at some of the best and worst comic book covers by Rob Liefeld. So this is kind of like the history of Rob Liefeld through his comic book covers. When Rob Liefeld was just 17, still in high school, he would send his work to different publishers, just trying and hoping to get a deal. Now, he never really sent them to DC or Marvel because they're like, I don't have a chance in hell to get with them. But then one comic book publisher thought they'd give him a chance, and that was over at Megaton. Now, originally they thought he was too goofy, and they said, sorry kid, no. But then he sent him even more work, redrawing some of their own characters, and they said, all right, we'll give you some work. So in 1986, when he was just about 18 years old, they gave him his first interior at Megaton #5. And that comic book in a 9.8 is going to run you about $150. Shortly after, he got to put in his own creation, Youngblood, as kind of like an advertisement, hoping that he would be able to get this published someday. And that was in Megaton Explosion #1, and a 9.8 of that goes for about $250. Now he's all set to do the next Megaton interior comic book, but Megaton went out of business, and so they canceled the comic he was going to work on. So then he started going to different Comic-Cons, and one in San Francisco, he showed his work to DC Comics. Now they really liked his stuff, but they're kind of having trouble trying to find something for him to do. So they gave him kind of like this backup insert story in Warlord #131, and a 9.8 goes for about $100. Now they knew that he was something special and he had a lot of talent, but they just really couldn't find anything for him to do. They did give him his first ever cover in Checkmate #3 in 1988, and that comic runs for about $45 in a 9.8. But Rob Liefeld wanted more. He wanted to do the whole comic book, interior, cover, everything. But the editors just couldn't really find anything for him to do. But there was this title that no one wanted, but they said, well, why don't we give it to Rob Liefeld? Because the previous one of this series canceled due to low sales. So they were going to try to reboot it. This was Hawk and Dove, and this turned out to be Rob Liefeld's breakout comic book. So he did the mini-series there, and Hawk and Dove #1 and a 9.8 is going to run you about $125. After the breakout success over at DC with Hawk and Dove, Marvel kind of wanted him now. And so then he switched over to working over at Marvel in early of 1989. And the first thing he did over there was Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 23. But he just did some interior pencils, and a 9.8 is going to run you about $110. But usually with these annuals, they do them way ahead of time, but don't release them for many, many months. So this didn't come out until May of 1989. But the first actual cover he did for Marvel back in January of 1989 was Marvel Comics Presents number 19. And a 9.8 is going to run you about $60. The next thing he got to work on was actually Wolverine. Wolverine number 8. They used to have a front cover and a back cover, and it was always done by different artists. So he did the back cover of Wolverine number 8. And that was the first time you actually seen Rob Liefeld's kind of famous little like scroll where he writes his name Liefeld in it, where he signs all his comic books. That's actually the first time he actually wrote it like that. Before he'd just write his name, but now he gave it this little like scroll looking thing. A 9.8 is going to run you about $300 for this comic book. Now they liked what he did so much for Wolverine, they actually gave him a Wolverine comic book, Wolverine Saga #1. And then they're like, well, we actually need to fill in for some X-Men comic books. Because at the time, they needed an ongoing artist for X-Men. So they gave him X-Men 245, and that's going to run you about $70 in a 9.8. Now they ended up going with Jim Lee, who did 248, because they just thought his style fit best and he was a better seller than Rob Liefeld at the time. But Rob Liefeld still wanted to do X-Men characters. So the next one he gave, which is actually a pretty good cover of his, was What If #7 with Wolverine as part of S.H.I.E.L.D. And that's going to run you about $75 and 9.8. So like with most things with Rob Liefeld, the publishers seem to just give him something that no one wants to work on or is a failing thing. That seems to be kind of his MO at this point. So they decide to give him the worst selling X-Men franchise they have, and that is New Mutants. And he started with New Mutants number 85. And this is actually the first time that Rob Liefeld and Todd McFarlane team up together. And a 9.8 is going to run you about $90. Shortly after, they give him the entire comic book, not just the cover. And so New Mutants 87 was the first time he got to do the entire comic book. And that's also the first appearance of Cable. And that's going to run you $350. But Rob Liefeld wanted more. He didn't want to do just the art. He wanted to write and plot the comics as well. So by issue number 98, he was the full-fledged writer and artist on New Mutants. And issue number 98 is also the first appearance of Deadpool, and that's going to run you about $1,000 and a 9.8, and arguably his most famous character he's ever created. Now at this point, New Mutants went from the worst selling mutant X-Men franchise that they had to the best selling. And by issue 100, he said, I want to kill off all these characters and create something new. And he created the X-Force in New Mutants number 100, and that is going to run you about $75. And then came his best-selling comic book of all time in 1991. X-Force number 1 hit the shelves and sold 4 million copies. It was the number 1 selling comic book at the time until slightly later, Jim Lee beat it with X-Men number 1. Now, the reason why it sold 4 million copies was also, this is during the time when comic books were seen more as an investment and less to read. So people saw like, Action number 1 selling for $50,000. And they're like, these comics are going to be worth something. So people didn't buy just one copy to read. They bought like full long boxes thinking that this is going to be their retirement. I mean, the comic book only sells for $67 and a 9.8 currently, but people thought it was going to be thousands and thousands of dollars. So it was at the height of the speculation boom. Also, they had different trading cards in the packages, so you'd have to buy different comics to get all the trading cards. Again, those aren't really worth anything. But Rob Liefeld set himself as a rock star at Marvel Comics and as a comic book artist in general. So he continued working on X-Force, selling thousands upon thousands of comics. But during this time, there's turmoil going on at Marvel. A lot of the artists were unhappy. They would create these characters, and then Marvel would own them and get to do whatever they want with them, and they got really no royalties for them. So many of the creators there decided to leave and create Image Comics, like including Jim Lee and Todd McFarlane. Rob Liefeld also left as well, and each comic book artist was in charge of their own creations. So they created their own publisher and just distributed it through Image Comics. So they had a preview of some of the comics that are coming out. In Malibu Sun number 10, they previewed Rob Liefeld's very first created own comic book, Youngblood number 1, in 1992. And a 9.8 sells for $1,000. Shortly after, in 1992, Youngblood number 1 came out. And it's actually the first Image comic book, and it sells for $85 and a 9.8. Now, people were a little upset with this. They thought it didn't really make sense. The writing wasn't very good. And even Rob Liefeld himself apologized because he was working with a new writer, which he then fired after a few issues. But through Rob Liefeld's publishing, Extreme Studios, he was coming out with more and more comic books and doing many, many covers, many, many interiors. But this is kind of where things kind of changed. So this is kind of the start of when Rob Liefeld becomes a parody of himself, and his art just kind of looks all the same. He has that like weird small mouth butthole look I just can't really stand, and everyone's nose is super small, and honestly everyone's face kind of looks the same. It just get worse and worse. They don't really make any sense. So this is kind of the start of his bad artist era, and this is where most of the time when people think of Rob Liefeld and bad art comes from this era. But at the time, Rob Liefeld could do no wrong. His comics were selling hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and so he just kept going with it. And this is kind of the start with Prophet number 1. It sells for about $50. Then it even gets worse with the weird autonomy with Prophet number 2, and this sells for about $70. All through the early to mid 90s, Rob Liefeld was working at Extreme Studios, pumping out cover after cover after cover, and a lot of them were not good. You got something like Supreme Zero. This sells for about $50. Or how about Youngblood Strike Files number 5? This also is about $50. You got Bad Rock number 1. Or how about Shadowhawk 0? I mean, just look the way he's standing. That's the thing. It's like all these covers, not only the faces look weird, the autonomy is just weird, and the way they're posing is always just weird. Or War Child number 3. Just his hands are way, way too small for his body. But this was all Rob Liefeld's look. He got very popular for having very extreme looking characters, and it became the most notorious thing just a year later in 1996. Marvel Comics, after the big height speculation boom, wasn't doing very well. They were filing bankruptcy, their titles weren't selling very well, so they needed a revamp. They even brought Jim Lee to do Fantastic Four, and they thought, why don't we bring the kid that had, at the time, the #1 selling comic of all time, X-Force, and he really helped us out. Let's have him come and revamp some of our characters. And that started in 1996, and they gave him $3 million as a signing bonus in 1996. That's like, well, I don't know, like $10 million today. And he revamped, starting with Heroes Reborn 1/2. And that sells about $50. Now he was going to do a couple different titles. Avengers was one of the titles, and Captain America. And to promote this, he came out with the most famous bad art of all time, Captain America, where he's turned kind of sideways and his chest doesn't make sense and his arms don't really make sense. I mean, everyone's seen this 1,000 times, and that's what he came out to promote this. But I bet you didn't know this. Avengers #1 he came out with. It sells about $50 in 9.8. But it is the best-selling Avengers comic book in its entire franchise history. Out of every Avengers comic book ever, this one is the best selling. And so Marvel's like, awesome, this is working. Then he came out with Captain America #1. And this is about $60 in a 9.8. Wasn't the best selling one, but it was a pretty good selling one. So they're like, awesome, right on. We did well, we got Rob Liefeld, and he has proven himself. But here's the thing. Not very many issues later, it started tanking in sales. It tanked so bad that after 6 issues, they decided to cancel Rob Liefeld and just put some other artist on there. I think at this point, his art had just became a parody of himself. It was even so bad that he was contracted to do the new Mission Impossible comic book in 1996. But the comic book wasn't released because Tom Cruise thought he looked too feminine in some of the panels. So he had to go back and redraw it to re-release the comic book because it was recalled originally. So at this point, he was fired from Image Comics, although he says that he quit. But the people just couldn't work with him anymore, and they said he was doing things that weren't good business sense for Image Comics. So at this point, he left his Extreme Studios publication and created a new one, Awesome Comics. And after leaving Captain America, he's like, I'm gonna create my own type of Captain America. There was a character called the Fighting American that was owned by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, and he tried to get the rights, but apparently they wanted too much money. So he said, screw that, I'm just going to create my own, called the Fighting Agent, who is very similar to Captain America. So Marvel had to sue and say, hey, look, you cannot use this character and make him throw his shield and all that kind of stuff like Captain America. And personally, I think he just kind of created that because he wanted revenge, because they basically kicked him off Captain America. I mean, why else would you go through all these hoops to create a competitor to Captain America after he's got kicked off of Marvel's Captain America because of low sales? Maybe he wanted to prove something. Nonetheless, he was still working at Marvel doing a few comic books, mostly Deadpool at this point. And he did Wolverine #155 for Deadpool Wolverine Battle. And that is going to cost you about $110 for a 9.8. And of course, he still would do comic books for his own line and also Marvel at this point, but he still continued doing his typical thing that was popular in the early 90s that was different and extreme, but doesn't really hold up to today. So he continued doing work at Marvel, mostly Deadpool stuff. He did Cable and Deadpool #1, and that's going to be at $120. And yeah, these covers, man. Then he did X-Force #2, another great cover. I mean, look how he's holding that sword. I don't know, it just looks very awkward. Again, this is the kind of style that was probably popular because it was so different and so extreme compared to what they're used to in the 80s. Just vastly different. People with like shoulders this high, packs everywhere, like autonomy doesn't really make sense, just very extreme, big and bulky. But now it's been overused and just doesn't look good. And then he has Major X number 2, yikes, and that's only about $35. But he continued working at Marvel, mostly doing Deadpool, until he finished his tenure and retired from drawing any Marvel characters, Deadpool, anything ever again. And Deadpool Team Up number 5 was the last time he ever worked on a Marvel comic book. That came out earlier this year. And that, in a 9.8, recently sold for $16. So not very much. He's still going to do a few more comic books, but mostly his own stuff, mostly like Youngblood and different projects he's working on. But this is going to be his own, not anything to do with any major publication ever again. And he said he's pretty much retired. Nonetheless, I think Rob Liefeld created his own unique style starting in the early 90s, but then later became more of a parody of himself as time went on. But you can't take away from the fact that he was one of the youngest artists of all time and a rock star in the comic book world, creating one of the best well-known characters of all time, Deadpool. Anyways, let me know what you think of Rob Liefeld's art and comic books in general in the comments below, and have a good day.